dance song. Good afternoon, everybody. It's great to see you. My name is Stephanie Plunkett. I'm Deputy Director and Chief Curator, and we're very, very happy that you're here, and we have a really special afternoon for you. We are, of course, thrilled that award-winning illustrator David Macaulay is here to talk to us today. David is actually a very long-time friend of the Norman Rockwell Museum. In fact, when this building opened in 1993, he actually was on our board and created the invitation to the opening event. So he created a drawing that invited people in. So he's really been a big part of our thinking here at the museum, and every time he comes back, it's like welcoming back a very special friend. But David's art and his extensively researched process work for Crossing on Time, Steam Engines, Fast Ships, A Journey to the New World is on view in our current exhibition, Finding Home for Artist Journeys. Have some of you had a chance to look upstairs yet? Yes? Great. Okay. So the exhibition on view actually features 4 unique and, in my mind, very compelling visual memoirs that have been inspired by personal migration stories through time and place. First exposed at the young age of 11 to the superliner SS United States during his family's immigration from Great Britain to America, David returned years later to illustrate the story of the most advanced steamship of its time, its builder, and his own immigration experience. Incorporating his family's stories into the overarching narrative of the steam age and the great ships that set speed records across the Atlantic, he also explores the ship's construction and the life of its remarkable designer and engineer, William Francis Gibbs. A little about David, and I could never really say enough because he has accomplished so much, but during his career as an illustrator and educator, he has been propelled by an innate sense of curiosity and an abiding interest in historical and technological marvels, both large and small. His ability to view objects with the trained eye of an artist and an architect result in imagery that distills complex functionality into clearly articulated visuals. A graduate of the Rhode Island School of Design, where he completed a degree in architecture, David employed his innate talent in drawing as a means of close observation to conceptualize, research, write, and illustrate his own projects. His first book, Cathedral, was published in 1973, followed by a series of popular and critically acclaimed books focusing on architecture and design, as well as more whimsical narratives. So some of these are going to be very familiar to you. Motel of the Mysteries, Ba, Why the Chicken Crossed the Road, and the now classic and updated tome, The Way Things Work. Ship, Mosque, The Way We Work, Built to Last, and the Caldecott winning Black and White. Rome Antics, and Angelo are just a few of his books. Developed over the course of 5 years, Crossing on Time is David's latest and most intensely researched book so far. Is it? Maybe not. Well, it's the latest, yeah, the body book, right. And it really brings to life an amazing and compelling tale, and so David's going to talk a lot about that today. Thank you all for being here, and thank you so much, David.
Thank you. Thanks for coming. Weather's being very helpful.
Yes.
Yeah, I'm going to show you some pictures. I should tell you in advance that I actually put another 40 pictures, 40 or 50 slides into this show on Friday or Thursday. And I was a little concerned as I added to the show that I would be burying you. So I'm going to talk quickly over many of the slides, but I wanted to show you, to give you a sense of the number of things, the number of images that have to be made, and the transformations and the moments of complete confusion on my part in this project. To start, a little autobiography. This is Lancashire, this is Bolton, this is the town I grew up in. This is a picture that was actually taken 10 years later, 10 years after we left. But this is how I remember Bolton. A bright, cheery environment. Look at this. I mean, but this is our town. Our street, however, had a tree. So I didn't realize how lucky we were, but nevertheless, here it is with the tree. And, but very narrow, I mean, the streets are so narrow, and this was the avenue. There's a back street behind this row of buildings that is like just the back street. And so the difference, the comparative difference in the scale of these streets is minimal, but nevertheless, it felt really different at the time. The family, the stars of the story. My brother, the artist, my sister, the smiler, and my mother and father. Now, the passengers on the ship were the four of us. My father, who as a father had responsibilities like setting up the apartment and beginning his new job in New Jersey, flew ahead to get started. So we were on the ship. It was my mother's job to shepherd us onto that ship and off that ship at the other end when we hit New Jersey. She was seasick the entire time, which I did not know until years later. And she never let on. She was tough. She never let on. But the great thing about being on a ship is and you're in tourist class. This is not first class where all the options are available. Tourist class where two of them are available. One is standing on the deck looking at the horizon, not compelling. And the other is going to the movies because they were free. And that was a treat that as a 10-year-old kid I had never experienced before. 3 times a day, go to the movies and just walk in like you owned the place. It was fabulous. All I knew about the United States, besides cowboys and Indians, was the Empire State Building. And this is my big book of science. And you can see the old illustration trick where you want to sort of put something in context, in this case, the Empire State Building in the context of New York by showing the Battery. And because the scale of these things is somewhat different, although not this different, you confuse the 10-year-old mind by creating this layer of fog down here. Now, growing up in the north of England, I mean, fog was like a regular thing, and it was usually dark. So I just assumed that this was a very realistic depiction of the relationship between the tip of Manhattan and the Empire State Building. This is the building that I was absolutely certain we would be able to see from the ship just as we passed Ireland. I mean, look at the scale of it. I absolutely took it literally. It never occurred. Now, one thing, this is the United States. I did not know that. I mean, it was years later that I looked at this picture and thought, oh my God, that's the ship we were on. I didn't even see this part of the drawing. I saw that part of the drawing, and that was the lure, that was the goal. Whatever else America might have to offer, was going to give this kid that view when we arrived. Who could ask for more? Early drawing to sort of set the scene and an opening paragraph and a very quick, sketchy view of the north of England, row housing and all that sort of stuff, and bricks. That's basic thing. There's more color here that, as you've seen in the slide, actually existed, but a little bit of that warm, welcoming color as opposed to the sort of soot-colored walls of brick. I thought maybe this is a page that could do more. Maybe I could actually give a little subplot at the top of this thing by shrinking the text, stealing a little space from this drawing, and just showing you the process of packing and getting ready to go and putting stuff on the truck and so on and so forth. Now let's simplify it. Let's go back and draw Lancashire the way I sort of remember it. Here's a car with the lights on, leaving in the morning, picking us up perhaps to take us to the train station. And there's the train in the background. So always trying to figure out if there's more I can say in an illustration without changing or losing the focus. In the end, the drawing I did was this. And it's a pencil drawing. It was made in pieces. You know, this whole section was sort of drawn in, on one piece of tracing paper. The town hall, which I drew several times. The train station, which I also drew several times. The train in the corner kept getting larger and larger because I really wanted you to see the train and the 4 people waiting to board. You'll see us again in a moment. There we are. But in 1700s. waiting for a ship to pull in, which would of course be wind power, and somebody would be rowing from the ship to the shore to pick up the passengers and so on. And you could be waiting there forever. And to sort of suggest the vehicles that we would be using, I played with the clouds and the sky. That was my thought, the sort of dramatic, Wyeth-like, I guess, or is Wyeth the guy? Or Pyle or somebody like that, but playing with these ships and big sails and stuff like that, but as part of the sky. So, that influence sort of crept in here. And I only drew those two ships once. I just kept using them. By working digitally, which is something I have come to over the last 10 years, I'm able to do that. And the problem is I'm able to do it forever, which means the clock is ticking and you're still playing with some little detail that you've tweaked beyond, it's barely surviving the tweaks. A little, maybe an office to give it a little more sense of place. Maybe not an office, maybe just a wall. Still standing there waiting for the ship. More ships now, a few little pieces to fill in. Maybe a barrel. Good to have a barrel in front with some rope to reinforce the sense that there's potential harbor activity, and a seagull and some rats. Maybe not the barrel and the rope and the seagull, maybe just some rats. The family is still waiting for the ship, So this was the final image, but it took, and I showed you just the tip of the iceberg of the sketches I went through to decide what to show and what not to show. Part of this process, every bit as important as drawing, is editing. And it's one of the hardest things because you draw something sometimes, and you really like it, but it doesn't belong. And it takes a while to say, okay, not here. The great thing about working in layers on the computer, I don't draw on the computer, I draw on tracing paper and then scan. But the great thing about being able to create layers is I can make the layer with the barrel go away. And then I can put it back just by pressing a button. And on, off, that sort of thing. Anyway, the important thing is here that it was wet in the coal mines, and they were desperate for a form of machinery, something that would allow them to remove water from deep in the mines so that the miners had at least a fighting chance of staying alive down there as they were chipping away at the very walls of the tunnel that was supporting the weight above them. Horrible job, but the invention of a steam engine, this is a model of the first one, was really significant, and it did change the way mines operated, and probably did work well for the miners themselves. The pump, of course, could only work from a certain depth. Then you would have to have another pump that went down another 30 feet, and then another pump, another 30 feet, and you'd keep bringing it up, that sort of thing. There's a drawing of one of the more advanced mechanisms proposed by a guy named Agricola in his 16th century book on mining. I just thought it was such a wonderful Rube Goldberg kind of contraption. So it's in there, and the horses are, turning the device, the winch that's fastened to the gear, which is turning the smaller gear, which is turning the crank, which is hooked to the levers from which hang the buckets at each of those levels. It's all there for those who are interested in this kind of thing. Or you can slide right across the page to the horse. And the whole thing about the horse is that if you lift a horse by surprise, this is probably what's going to happen. And that's the thing. It was surprise. It wasn't essential that it be a surprise and so on and so forth, but I just thought, and I discovered, I was talking to an 8-year-old boy this morning, and he kept coming back to this drawing. And he was delighted and charmed by this drawing, which made me think, I did make the right decision. But I did wonder. I really did wonder. But what we've gone from this, all that stuff, all those parts, we've gone to a cylinder and a piston. And we're using atmospheric pressure and the creation of a vacuum with gunpowder below the piston inside the cylinder. Atmospheric pressure will push the piston down as soon as you blow out the air below it, and that will create tension on the rope, which will raise the horse and so on. This is a drawing of the first pump that was actually built to raise water from mines and so on. I was thinking, from the beginning, while sketching, I'm also, when I get tired of really thinking about complicated stuff, I start just playing with color to see if I can throw some color in there that gives me an idea of how I might go when we start sort of digitally painting these images. It's so weird that we are working on the computer, digitally painting these images, trying to make it look like you used a brush, a real brush, and real paint. And so it's so bizarre, but I'm doing it too. I'm trying to sort of, okay, how do I make it look less mechanical, washier, and so on? And you end up finding these textures and stuff like that. And now I have on a scale of 1 to 100, I'm at 1%. Knowledge of what the computer can do and what Photoshop can do for me and so on. So I've got room to develop my understanding and appreciation of this, although my appreciation has already grown significantly over the last couple of years as I have really learned to make this thing work for me. But you're always trying to play with the technique and stuff like that and make it look more handmade. The spread from the book looks like this. I took a portion of that engraving you saw but return to the model idea, so you have a sense of somebody working this out on their kitchen table, which I think Newcomen probably did. And so it's a sort of, even though the lever sort of hangs in space, those kinds of things. But you get a sense of, boiler underneath the water, steam pumped into the piston, into the cylinder, below the piston, which is up here. Then you crank in the cold water, which is up here in this tank, spray it into the cylinder. It completely, evaporates the steam, or condenses, not evaporates, it condenses the steam, creating a vacuum under here. Atmospheric pressure pushes down on the top of the piston, pulling the lever, lifting the pump, which brings water from some mysterious place down here, off screen, anyway. I love that stuff. The thing is, in this, trying to do this in a book like this, I'm thinking, will anyone else love this kind of stuff? Or have I just lost my audience for 2 pages? And in a room like this, have I just lost like 50 people? And, that dog running away from something, looking a little uncomfortable, is running away from this. An early steam-powered toy that was, it exists in Birmingham. It's in the museum in Birmingham. It's about 18 inches high. And it and larger versions terrified people who ran into these machines on the street and had never seen anything that wasn't pulled by a horse moving that fast. And how do you stop it? But that was a problem, actually, because you couldn't always stop it. Watt comes along and takes the technology and improves it tremendously and decides that he's going to attach this shaft on the end of the lever to a wheel, close to the axle of the wheel. And now we're creating rotary motion from the up and down motion of the cylinder, thanks to the lever. Once you've got a wheel, you can put there are wheels on vehicles. Why not take one of the wheels and actually attach it to steam power, which is done in this French device up here. The boiler is a little over the top, but this is actually to scale. So you can see why this was perhaps not a runaway success, because it's always trying to get past its own boiler and lug this thing around. And if you're not on like stone streets, you're pretty much finished. And yet this was designed to carry cannons and things of that nature for the military. And probably you wouldn't always have stone streets if you were trying to sort of plan your battle. How about paddle wheels on a wooden boat? This was the first use in France also of these paddle wheels. I don't know how well it worked, but you could see how these ideas could become compelling relatively quickly. Or you could take this machine with its wheel and you could turn shafts, and with belts you could connect those to rotating shafts to spinning machines and looms and things of that nature, and begin to power an entire mill. So these are, this is an earlier sketch than the one you just saw. This should have preceded it actually, but the river became this device that started to thread through these early drawings. And I wanted it to always show the boats and the evolution of boats, steam-powered boats. No matter what else was going on in the foreground, the river would always be there as your kind of timeline, literal timeline, but also visual document. And I loved building models as a kid. So the idea of having somebody building a model of the ship to show you all the pieces, but also hint at the fact that these are created by humans who have these ideas, and they do build models, and then they get a bunch of people and they work full size on flat land and build the real thing and push it into the water. So that idea comes up again and again. The steam engine, as I've already implied, was quite heavy. The only way to sort of have them traveling fast was to actually build rails for them to travel on. And that happened first in the coal mine. But then they realized, well, we don't just have to drag coal around, we can put people in these cars too, along with the coal, and or carry horses and so on. So there's the river creeping back in. The railway is now born and part of this story. The railway a little more finished. A stationary steam engine built to go into a coal field and raise and lower, it could be used for pumping, it could be raising and lowering coal, miners. The Claremont, Fulton's Claremont, and this is the Charlotte, this is a Scottish ship with a paddle wheel at the back. This crazy contraption, this is from Philadelphia, would actually move oars back and forth. So it was like still rowing, but steam-powered rowing. This is the nuttiest device. I mean, you could see 3 here, 3 here, 3 and 3. So this thing is rowing its way across the Delaware River, steam, but still using oars. So there was a missing link there somehow that was sort of taken care of by the supplanting with the wheel. And there's the model builder again, building, and the river comes to the ocean and finally expands into the sea. And I'm setting up what's next, of course, which is not just traveling up the coastal waterways or the rivers, but actually crossing the Atlantic. The model builder's there. The model builder disappears. I got rid of him finally and just put the ship, this is the Savannah. This is the first ship to cross the Atlantic with, I say with rather than aided by much steam. It had steam power, it had that capability, but mostly they used sails. I don't think they fully trusted the steam engine at that point, but it had one. So it's the first ship to use some steam power as it's crossing the Atlantic. And it's soon followed by other ships that are like suddenly 50 feet longer, 60 feet longer, and there's this race on, because this is such an exciting possibility and there's money to be made. The steam locomotive for the railway is changing. The engines are becoming more complicated. 2 pistons now, not just 1. And now we get to Brunel, who completely just blows the scale of this thing apart. Starting with smaller ships, but now we're up over 200 feet, up at 230 feet. Finally, with the Great Eastern, up to 600 feet. Wooden ship, iron ship, iron ship. There's the Great Britain, and there's the forgotten the name of it. Anyway, there's the iron one. There's the second one, and it's considerably longer. Now, why go to iron? Wood was fine. It was working for centuries. Well, when you get up to 200 feet, there's a lot of bending if you're crossing the Atlantic, and that bending on a wooden ship is going to create problems between planks and joints and so on and so forth.
What year are we?
We are in the 1820s, 1830s with these guys. New engine, but also a new device. This suddenly transforms this kind of transportation. Yeah, you can use the wheels on the side of the ship, and Brunel held on to them. He did use them. But the problem is, as the ship is tipping from side to side, as it's rocking, it's lifting one wheel out of the water while the other one digs deep. So your ship is going like this, I would imagine, the whole way, which is, I mean, not just a rough trip, but it's going to slow things down a little bit. But he's got, oh, the one other thing I wanted to show you. So how do you show the transformation from a wooden structure to an iron structure? Without actually making a little box and putting iron and wood and labeling it and so on. I just let the iron and the wood, with a color over it, transform from background to the ocean, to the sea in which these things are sort of bobbing. But I don't have to draw attention to it. It's there. And you may not see it until the 4th time you read the book or see this page. That's fine. I don't want you to get it all at once. I want you to always be rewarded when you come back the 2nd time or the 3rd time. The Great Eastern, 600 feet, designed to carry 4,000 passengers. A disaster, really, from the beginning. But it had all the good stuff. It had all the stuff that kind of set up where this naval architecture is going. It had a double hull. So if something happened to the outer hull, the inner hull, which is really just a smaller model, a smaller version of the outer one, but inside it, separated by about 3 feet. And here's the cross-section through the ship. Actually, it's a piece of one of the plans of the ship that I've just taken and put in the background of this drawing. But you can see it in my drawing here, the double hull. So that's one safety feature. The other is that along the length of the hull, it's divided into sections, compartments. And if one of those compartments fills up with water because something happens and it even breaks through both hulls, the ship will be okay. It'll be probably still stable enough to get to port, to be fixed, or to run aground somewhere so that everyone can get off it. I was intrigued by, I wanted to show the sections, the compartments, and I also wanted to really get across the sense that this ship was bigger than anything that had ever been built, and it wouldn't, not only would it not fit in most docks, there wouldn't be room for it, but it wouldn't even fit in a book this size. So I broke it apart and sort of jumbled it up, except it's in the right order. So if you follow the flow, you'll still see the ship. So that, I mean, those kinds of ideas, those kinds of devices, the number of different pieces of equipment, propeller, engine at the back for the propellers, the engine for the paddle wheels, and 6 masts, all fully equipped with sails. So this guy was, he was all set, except it just never really worked. It was never a success, and it was pretty much abandoned until finally they were trying to figure out how to lay this transatlantic telegraph cable from Ireland to Nova Scotia. And the ship finally found a use and became the ship that was used to carry the cable on, a spool in this huge space at the back, at the stern end. And that's how we got our first transatlantic cable. So the Great Eastern was not by any means a waste. It really did set a standard of what was possible, and a lot of it had to do with safety. The more passengers, the more the builder of the ships and the businesses owning them became concerned with the whole safety thing. The steel ship was next, and the Servia was the first steel ship. Why does that matter? Because, the iron hull was heavy, but it was lighter than the wooden hulls that preceded it, of the same size. It was lighter. This is even lighter still because it's steel. It can be thinner than the iron walls that, of which the hull is made. So that's one thing. The Edison lighting system, so we have some electric lights on board. That's a nice attraction in your sort of pamphlet that you're handing out to get people to take your ship. And the engines are becoming more complicated, using steam multiple times. The first steam comes into one piston, and then it's exhausted into 2 other pistons that are larger. So you're not having as much pressure from the steam, but you're having a larger surface over which to apply that pressure, so it works. This is how I ended up telling this little story, focusing on the engine and the boiler, using those constellation drawings where you normally expect to see a guy with a bow and arrow, or somebody's belt or something along those lines. And then the ship, all you really see of the ship is a light up here, which I don't know existed, but it does now. And then these little lights back here for the sort of the public area. And now the race is on. These ships are just getting longer and more luxurious. They're finding ways of competing with each other in an increasingly popular market. The engines are getting larger. To remind myself, I've put that thing that looks like Gibraltar, but a bad Gibraltar, and the ships are passing it. That's basically this steam engine, 6-cylinder steam engine that was used in a ship that was going to be launched in Philadelphia. But this is the result of the race and the transformation in the power source. Okay, this is the wall of the studio, and there's a sort of the replica of sorts upstairs in the gallery. And this implies a sense of order and organization, and it implies that the artist has a grasp over the material. At last, it's a complete fake. I had no idea what I was doing at this point. I didn't know whether this was a history book, whether it was a biography, an autobiography, whether it was just engineering and technology, marine architecture. I really didn't. I was so lost after working on it for a year and a half or so. And I sort of panicked, and I stopped working on it. And I just needed time to think about what I was doing. I think the biggest worry I had was, would anybody really be interested in all of this information? It's a lot of stuff. So anyway, you see the whole thing kind of shrunk down here. I'm already trying to shrink it because I've been getting lost in my own enthusiasm for all this technology. But at the same time, I started sketching, a view of the inside of the United States, but not in any kind of believable way. Those are two different points of view. But what you see here is coming from the turbine, which would be here, and the boilers over here. It's the propeller shaft. And here's another view of it. There's the turbine, and there's the propeller shaft. There's the turbine, and there's another propeller shaft on the other side of the hull. So that's, I draw like this, and I draw fairly quickly because I'm desperately hoping that I will stumble across some sort of idea that I think, this is what I'm looking for. This is what I want to do. This is how I should handle this. So there are pages and pages in sketchbooks and on loose sheets of tracing paper where I'm trying to figure this out. Plus, at the same time, I'm looking at photographs that were taken during the construction of the ship in Newport News between 1949 and 1952. And I've outlined parts of the photograph and put, sort of labels on them so I can send this to one of my experts. And I take advantage of experts all the time. I win them over by letting them think that I'm, totally committed, as they are, to the study of this object. I will be committed like they're committed, but only for a year. And then I move on. But we don't have to talk about that. So I find that I work with people, I'm really lucky in this sense. I work with people who are so knowledgeable, far than I will ever be about any of the topics that I deal with. But they're so generous also with their time and their enthusiasm, because they do sense that I can get at least some of this information out to a larger world. Yeah. So it's a win-win thing. So I start again, clean all that stuff off the wall, and blank sheets, and now focus just on the United States, and carefully begin to put things up in sequence. Actually, this does begin with Gibbs, the designer of the ship, and his inspiration. This is Philadelphia, early sketch, the ship's pulling into New York Harbor, a distorted map, but I just needed to show these two landmarks, basically. And here's a shipyard, Cramp Shipyard in Philadelphia. Another drawing of it, because I also need to be able to show you the steam engine that is going to make it possible for ships of this next generation to actually cross the Atlantic. And then finally, here's the drawing I actually ended up doing, looking from the other side, completely changing my point of view. Text, space is the water. Now, you look at that beautiful blue and you think, that's not the Delaware River. You're right, it's not it is the Delaware River, but not really the Delaware River. But it's a blue background, and that says to us all, possibly, especially with things bobbing around in it or floating on it, it must be water. It's the illusion of water. And you can see New York is still here, but it's upside down. The label for New York is upside down, as I've sort of if I moved to the other side of the river, I had to turn New York upside down. Okay, 1896. We are seeing the launch of a ship called the St. Louis, and this 8-year-old boy named William Francis Gibbs is with his father and his brother. They've gone to see the launch, and from that moment on, he made this decision to learn everything he could about ships. And he was really charting the path that would guide him through his entire life, and his personal life as well as his professional life. So variations, changing the size of it slightly. I wanted, this was okay. I liked the drawing. I liked all the people in the crowds. But I wanted to kind of emphasize the 8-year-old's view of the ship. What was their impression? And my guess is Gibbs's impression was, he was obviously impressed, significantly impressed. It was a transformative experience, but I need a symbol for that. So what I wanted to do with them was make the ship so large that if you were 8 years old and standing down there anywhere near the bottom, it would have seemed like an entire building, like part of the city, sliding down the runway into, not the runway, whatever it's called, the ways, down into the blue waters of the Delaware. So the final drawing looks like this. This is sort of, a hint at a representation of the steam being created as the friction between the wooden supports of the ship slide against the ways. And it just gets really hot and noisy, and the smoke even starts pouring out. So anyway, that's how that drawing evolved. Here's a photograph. This is the launch of the ship. This is all I had to work with. I think I found a plan of the ship, and maybe one photograph of it at sea. The rest is just me having to figure out where to be. The little stand with the people in it is over here. There are the ways. And so we're up here somewhere in the finished drawing. We're never down low. There was too much foreshortening involved, and I didn't think that was going to actually help the information. Anyway, and the press stand, just in case you wanted to know, is right here. Where the press stands. Here's an important invention, a really important invention, the steam turbine. At last, we're starting to replace those pistons and all that sort of stuff, especially on the bigger ships. And a steam-powered turbine basically powered the Lusitania across the Atlantic. Gibbs, in his bathtub, at the age of 12, is reading highly advanced technical journals on ship building and so on and so forth, many from England. Goes to Harvard, flunks out, probably because he's dreaming about ships the whole time and wondering, why am I here? Why am I in Cambridge? Why am I at Harvard? Because your father wants you at Harvard and because you're going to be a lawyer. Neither of those were entirely, positive influences. So here we are, Lusitania on the left, Mauritania. Look how many boilers it takes, the orange squares, to provide the power for the turbines, the 4 turbines at the back of the Lusitania and the Mauritania. I won't go into details about how it works, but here's Gibbs. I'm going to get now into Gibbs a little bit and where he worked and how he had some success very early on and so on, selling the idea, although nothing ever came of it, except a career was born, and he was supported. So I've got Brunel kind of toying with, in his imagination, sort of toying with young Gibbs, encouraging him to build bigger. No, that's too small. Make it bigger. Make it faster. It's how Brunel, I think, would have thought. And make up for the Great Eastern and try to put it out of people's minds and sort of, that sort of thing. Here is Gibbs and his brother, Frederick. Frederick was not just the bookkeeper, he was more creative than that and a more important part of the team, but he would think about things like, should we have 2 ships? That was pretty typical, but let's do 2 ships. And if we're going to do, so we can, one's going this way and one's going the other way at the same time. So we're always moving passengers. The ships that he's designing, I have sort of floating overhead on the wallpaper, sort of translucent. Drawing the wallpaper was my favorite part, along with the light bulb. But he's also suggesting things like Frederick, that is, let's build a terminal in Montauk on Long Island so that people don't have to come into Manhattan right away. They get off the ship in Montauk, sleepy Long Island, and get off in a very kind of leisurely way onto a train, which will bring them down to Penn Station or whichever Penn Station, I guess. And then they can deal with Manhattan and all that has, but they've had a transitional period. Anyway, that's how Frederick was thinking. The first job they got was to basically refurbish a German liner that was taken over during the war. It had been parked in Hoboken. It was the Vaterland, was the German name. It became the Leviathan, and it was massive. And the Germans, understandably, were reluctant to give the U.S. the plans. So the only way to resolve, they were a little miffed that this ocean liner, which was a pride of the German fleet, was now under American control. Well, you sink the Lusitania, you take your chances. So, but they're going to do a complete refurbishment of this and turn it into an American luxury liner, but you need plans for that. You mean basic plans. So Gibbs and the boys, like 100 people, measure every square inch of the ship and produce a new set of plans. So that's what I'm suggesting and hinting at here. This is an actual cross-section of the ship. I just borrowed it and inserted it in this sort of collage approach. Then I drew some hands and a ruler. And then I included a new drawing of the latest development in the boiler technology, which in the book, this color leads all the way up here into this. This is this boiler. I hadn't thought here to keep these colors the same so that you would understand there being some link. The Gibbs company became extremely successful during the Second World War, and he designed 75% of the ships used in the Navy. Now, not all big ships, but all the practical stuff. And it made a lot of money, and more importantly, he learned a lot about ship design and technology and power and all the different technologies that were, whether it's radio or welding, all these things that were improving, so that when it came time to build his ships from scratch, his liners, he had all this stuff in his head. He didn't have to invent stuff. He just saw ways of using all the best stuff and using them in the smartest way. Okay, so there are all the ships, and he's looking at them. And Frederick, with his one hand still on the calculator, sort of adding up the dollars. But that didn't seem like much of a composition. So I went this way instead. Put them both in the water. And Gibbs is looking at what will be his first liner, the America, and larger than any of the Navy vessels. And that's where it started, and gradually it evolved here. I reduced all those ships to just the lines in the background, the roll of paper from the calculator, of course, streaming across the page, endless dollars. And Gibbs is launching his ship very gently, unfortunately, though, into the hands of the Navy, who have taken it over to use it as a troop ship, which means the first thing you have to do is cover all that red, white, and blue and beautiful shiny black with gray. But his goal is to play with the big boys, to be one of the ships that earns the Blue Riband, which is this award given to the fastest ship crossing the Atlantic, particularly from east to west, against the grain, against the current. So you've got the Rex and the Normandy and the Queen Mary. He wants to be next in line. But he's got the America. It's small, it's only like 700 feet. They're going to need something bigger and more powerful. I put the Empire State Building in here because I don't want you to forget that there's this kid who's getting on the ship eventually, whose dream it is to see the Empire State Building. Plus, this competition, much of it, late 20s, early 30s, is simultaneous with the building of the Empire State Building and the appearance of these, monuments to architecture and to cities. He looks, the inspiration is there. But I took the Empire State Building, and like the age-old thing you see with any book about a ship has to have the Empire State Building in it somewhere, and you have to turn the ship on its end and say, look, it's this high. Sort of meaningless, but I decided to go with that anyway, but make the Empire State Building sort of move in the same direction as the ships. But all those lines represent 100 feet. So from 0 to 1280 or whatever it is, and you can actually see the Normandy, longer slightly than the Queen Mary, but not as fast as the Queen Mary.
Do the flags have any significance?
The flags belong to the countries.
No, the ones he's holding.
Oh, no, well, yes, but you won't see it here, but I cut out a spread. But each of those lines with flags on it connects to 4 of the Gibbs ships, a fleet he built, a small fleet, which was one of the office jobs. And they were ships, but they were fairly small, and they were designed to go from New York to the West Coast and back. And he was holding onto them like they're toys in a pond. And they're all connected to his hand so that they don't get away. That's what that's about. There's the America here, and there's the United States. You can see a sizable lead. Look at just the size of the funnels comparatively. The passengers, so we have 2 kinds of passengers. We have 14,000 soldiers on the left, and we have 2,000 crew, 3,000 maybe with crew and passengers on the right. Those are the 2 markets that this ship was designed for. It was never called up as a troop ship, but because it was offered as a possible troop ship, 75% of its funding came from the U.S. government. Not everybody was happy about that. Gibbs was delighted. So now we have to design the ship, and I have to do this based on all the blueprints and photographs I have and all that sort of stuff. This was in a way the sort of the hardest part of really coming to understand this thing 3-dimensionally, but also in layers, horizontal and vertical sections. The ship is cut like a loaf of bread into slices called frames, 300 frames basically, from one to the other, 300 slices of bread. And if you pull one out every so often, it will have a slightly different shape. Obviously very narrow near the bow, really fat and bulbous in the center, and then really weird at the back because it has to support the supports of the propeller shafts as they emerge from the hull. So you can see it here. It looks like, a cross-section of a cow, but not really, but here's the engine room and the boiler room. This is the boiler, and then the turbines, and these are reduction gears. These shafts are turning way too fast to turn a propeller. Like 5,000 RPM, 3,000 RPM. You turn a propeller at 3,000 RPM, you're not going anywhere. But you're going to churn up the water, and that'll be fun for the creatures below. We have to figure out how to reduce the speed of these 2 shafts down to about less than 200 RPM so that it can turn a propeller at a reasonable rate. That's what that's all about. There will be a test. Typical floor plans. This one's now laying out all the cabins and the various rooms and the shafts that connect the engine rooms and boiler rooms with the funnels and so on and so forth. Lots of information. The anchor room up here, all that sort of stuff. Yeah, holding this all together, you can see, maybe you can't see, but when you walk the ship now, it's got nothing. It's been completely stripped of all the partitions, but the decks are still there. You don't know where you are. You don't know what deck you're on. You certainly don't know where you are in the ship. So often you'll see the frame number actually painted on something behind the scenes, but it's there. This one still remains, 220 and a half. So it's like, 18 inches past past 220 and 18 inches to the neck to 221. Got to be oriented. Typical blueprint showing the anchor areas. This is where the anchor would be lifted up, of the side anchors, the front anchor, the fore anchor. Here's the total plan. Some of these plans are 12 feet long. I think there's one that's even longer than that. But you can see with the ship, you're going to break it up anyway, but it just really needs. That's why the fold-out in the book was so important to me. I just wanted to say, okay, everything's been neatly contained and looks innocent enough in this book. And you get to this thing and you start to fold it out and it just keeps going. And I thought that was an important sort of gesture to remind the viewer of the reader of the size of this thing. The frames here, these are frame profiles like the ones you just saw, but in sequence. So you can begin to see how they define the tubes that emerge from the side of the hull. And these tubes carry the propeller shafts that are now 200 feet away from the engine room where they were powered. So, and there's a model upstairs on the wall that I did based on that particular plan. I cut it apart. Here's what the ship looks like now. Finally, a chance to go back and see the ship again. And this was the sort of last source of information and reference. I went back to see the real thing, having not seen it since I was 10. Okay, it's a fixer-upper, but nevertheless, these are the main doors at what they call Times Square. It was this at the center of the ship on B deck. All this stuff would be brought onto the ship and then sent either toward the bow or toward the stern. But I love the hinges. How can you not love those hinges? These massive things. I want to make a drawing that shows you where the hinges, how they attach and stuff. I didn't. Because I thought maybe just pushing my luck a little too much. This, though, I'm pushing my luck here anyway, even showing you this, but this is a detail I really love. Most of the ship has steel plates that overlap. But towards the bow and towards the stern, they want the plates to be on top of each other to create a single surface, to reduce friction, or just to look cool. I'm not exactly sure. But you can see how the rivets that are holding the plates, these overlapping plates together, are gradually disappearing. And then the steel is actually bent so that it sort of gradually takes its place on top of the plate below. And then you weld it. And the welding was good enough to make this every bit as strong as the rivets, maybe more so. Radar mast, funnel. Let's go up the radar mast. This is one of the hardest climbs I've made. It's not even that far up. But when you're going up a ladder, an extended distance, and you don't do that very often, I don't do it at all, and I would swear that the ladder was not entirely vertical, but that was leaning out slightly away from the wall. It felt like that by the time I got to the top of it. But I got up high enough to be able to get out and take a picture of the rusting deck. This is where I spent my time as a kid at the age of 10. This is what they also called the tourist class Promenade, or whatever. It had a fancy name, but it was basically a deck filled with equipment where we tourist class passengers were allowed to get fresh air and hang over the rails. You couldn't go in the front section. And the bridge is down below, right below me. The funnels, fantastic sculptural pieces. If we go inside these things, it looks like this. It's a model, it's a kit. And you got this is now all aluminum, aluminum construction. Everything above the main deck is aluminum to reduce the weight of the ship. And it's strong enough for the job. It doesn't have to cut through the ocean. It doesn't have to survive that. Only steel could do that. But the aluminum can certainly contain all the activities above deck. And so anyway, that's the model. And in the back, you can see the shafts, the ventilation shafts coming up from both sides, from 2 boilers down, from 4 boilers altogether, 2 on each side, up through this smokestack to vent. Or if you want to go up, keep climbing. If you haven't lost your joy of climbing by this point, you're mad. But nevertheless, little portholes. There are a couple of little trapdoors on the top of the funnel. So this is the forward funnel, the aft funnel. The railings are a little on the low side, so you don't want to be hanging over one of those railings. They have more to do with something to hold onto up there, but also to hang ropes from, so that the guys who had to keep painting the funnel would be able to hang their little wooden platforms and sit there and so on. Nice work if you can get it. The boiler room, the boiler's on the left-hand side. I was dealing with all these pipes. Now, obviously, I can't show all that stuff. I don't even want to show all that stuff. The engine room, I'll show you just a quick sequence. This is the high-pressure turbine. The exhaust from the high-pressure turbine, which there's the shaft going into a reduction gear. The exhaust steam goes into the low-pressure turbine, much bigger, but still capable of generating 3,000 RPM. There's the shaft of that propeller. 2 sets of reduction gears that sort of work together to create a single rotating speed. What do you do with that steam? Once it's gone through the low pressure, you have to send it through a condenser. This is the condenser. Those are the pipes of the condenser. Cold water, ocean water, is sort of sucked in from the bottom of the ship. It's scooped up, basically, sent through these pipes. It's cold, really cold. So the hot steam is drawn down because there's a vacuum created when the steam hits the pipes, and it turns into water, and it's captured below, and it's cleaned, and so on and so forth, and goes right back to the boiler to do the job again. Clean water being, a really valuable item on a ship. You don't have an endless supply of clean water, and these boilers are so efficient that they won't be able to tolerate water that's, not the cleanest possible water. So you just destroy the boiler. The end of the shaft looks like this. You have to go to Newport News, Virginia to actually see one. But look at that propeller. Look at those Phillips head screws. Look at this. Amazing. Like, how big is the screwdriver? And how do you actually handle it? A truck pulls up with a single screwdriver, and 400 Egyptians get out, and they basically, anyway. I needed a visual transition that would get us from the designing of the ship to the building of the ship. And I thought, I'll be really clever here. They've been making blueprints. That was the last drawing you saw in the book. And so I took some of them and I folded them into this origami bird flock. And I just sort of had them spreading off the page. And then as you turn the page, the idea was that they would be seagulls flying over the shipyard in Newport News. And that would be my clever way of making that anyway, it was too clever. So it doesn't appear anywhere except right here. Here's Newport News. There are the building of you can see the construction of the main components of the ship. It was all built in big sections, sub-assemblies. And the dry dock on the right, to the right of it, surrounded by, and the space within it surrounded by wooden scaffolding. Mostly wooden, not entirely, but mostly wooden scaffolding. We'll take another look at that. There's dry dock number 1, dry dock number 2. This is the beginning of the United States. This is the American. In for, refurbishment at the end of a season. And this is one of the few times when there is another photograph of them passing each other in New York Harbor. But you really get a quick sense of the scale. Cranes on both sides. I mean, I love that stuff. Cranes drive you crazy though when you try to draw them and get the scale right. Okay, sketching how to make these drawings of the construction of the ship. I'm basically doing now a cathedral, a city, a pyramid project, but in very few pages, because I don't want to create another whole 80-page book. So I have to go through this process to decide what I need to say and what I can leave out that will give you the essential information, the engine room. The photographs were taken from 2 points of view. Well, yeah, the bow and the stern, but at 2 different levels consistently. Up high, and this is the highest one now, and then lower down. That was it. The problem with this for me is the distortion, the foreshortening of the information melted. It was really hard to tell whether these partitions between the sections of the ship, the what? No, not the framing, but the compartments. That's the word I'm looking for. Those are the walls between compartments. It's the whole flood safety issue. This is also a double-hulled ship, so Brunel's influence, seeps right back into this. But this is what I had to work with, but I had to keep double-checking against my plans to figure out what was actually happening spatially. Drawings made by somebody who was hired by Gibbs and Cox to make renderings of the ship at various times in its construction. These were tremendously helpful and really detailed. I mean, fabulous pencil drawings. Yeah.
Was this like 1950? Where are we?
We are in 1950, 1950.
Yeah.
Yep. And this is a lower photograph. This is actually, sort of a rarer one. Actually, you can tell what's happening. But a piece of the ship that's going to be fitted into the stern eventually. Workers, lots of information, sometimes from videos, sometimes just photographs, but I used all of it to try to create enough knowledge so that I could draw the ship from any point of view I wanted to, and still know that I was more or less being accurate and true to the engineering information. The plates and the way the plates are assembled in the order, you might think they just stack them from top to bottom, but clearly that's not the way you do it. There are different reasons. So the next plate that goes in here, it may very well be that by this point we are welding a plate in here, but my guess is we're probably still, because it's up high and not in the water, hard to tell for sure. But, it wasn't just as simple like building a brick wall. They do this, and then the next one either travels over it or it's wedged in between. That's a detail you did not need to know. So now I'm trying to figure out how to compress all this information into a few drawings that will allow me to sort of give you a sense that you've been there to watch this happen. These are the early sketches. And we lower the first piece of subassembly in, and then we build the walls of the compartments, and you're inside the hull, and so on and so forth. Now we're at the stern, and you're seeing all the subassembled pieces at the stern, and the rudder, and the propellers, and so on. And at the bow, the anchors, I wanted those in, so details of the anchors and stuff like that. That's a really messy composition. Not going to win anybody over who isn't already excited about anchors. The middle section of the ship, very large, but anyway, here's the drawing of the dry dock for the book. The cranes were, as I say, a nightmare, but the worst part was drawing the shadows. And trying to make that up, because there's no photograph to work from in something like this. You just draw it until it looks believable. And you trust your own, sort of educational process that you actually learned enough to get it right. And you share it with a few experts who would notice something in theory that was wrong. This guy, the caisson, thank you. It's basically a hollow steel box. And it's a wall, and it's sort of moved into place against the ends of the dry dock. This is all water now, including what's the bathtub. It's full. And then you fill this with water, and of course it's going to sink slowly. And when it hits the bottom, you can then start to pump out the water behind it in the dry dock and dump it back into the river. But the pressure of the river against the caisson will keep it in place for as long as you want. See, that's clever. Here we are in the yard, moving the first piece up there of the keelson, and it's laid on this timber structure that supports the ship, basically, during its construction, and rests a little bit on the sides. And this whole sequence is like 4 images, 5 images, all that information you just saw. And this is how I managed to condense it. So when you go through it and you take your time and you don't read it just once, you'll get all you need to know and probably more. But that's all part of this process. That's why the editing becomes so important. Why the gloves? Well, first of all, you're working with steel, so you need to protect your hands. So these steel worker gloves would have been, and look at the photographs, everybody's wearing them. But the other reason I did it was quite simple. This is a combined African-American, white, working labor force. I don't know who's doing what exactly, and I'm sure there were some divisions. And I didn't want to get into it because it's not part of my story. So everybody's got gloves on to protect themselves, so you don't know. And you don't even think to ask the question. Funnels under construction, propellers put in place at the back. This sketch, this drawing, which is the drawing from the book, was done as a sketch. I was just playing with it. I'd sort of drawn it 1,000 times, couldn't get the perspective right, finally got something I liked, started to play with color. It's uncharacteristically smudgy and so on and so forth, atmospheric compared to the rest of the images in the book, but I knew I couldn't draw this better. So I just cleaned it up and stuck it in the book. And you won't notice, it doesn't stand out, but I want you to know that sometimes you reach a point where you recognize you've just achieved the best solution to a problem. And so what are you going to do? Draw it again just for the heck of drawing it again? Who's got time for that? I was going to show the construction of the funnels, but I decided to really minimize that. Now I'm just playing with color again, as I did with the steam engine way back when. You remember that, like 3 hours ago when we looked at those early steam engines? And the great thing, so I make a pencil sketch, and then I just start playing with and teaching myself how to do it, because I never learned how to use the computer like this at all, and I'm minimally proficient, minimally. But anyway, that's what these are. These are just testing. Now we see the ship. It's finished. It's in its dry dock. The propellers can all be easily seen, and so on. Gibbs is there to watch the ship, the water be pumped back into the bathtub. And this is a day before the christening of the ship. We have one photograph of him, but he's sitting on the other side looking at the water. So again, this had to be invented from various photographs of the ship, never from the right height. So, again, you draw it over and over again. And the little eyeballs in the two portholes at the back of the ship are just me losing control. So, they're admiring. Pardon? They're looking at him. And admiringly, and perhaps with gratitude. So it's launch day. It's the next day. It's christening time, and there, ladies are dressed up, and the champagne is hanging, and they always have the wife of somebody be the one who has to smash this bottle against the hull. Interesting decision. So they all get sprayed, and the band's playing, and there's a crowd, and it's like 112 degrees. But there are a radio broadcast from the site at the time. So this was an important American event, and it was always marketed that way. This is an American ship. And it was, in fact, the largest ship ever built in America, passenger liner ever built in America, and the fastest ever built in the world. The depth lines. Now, this is what you're supposed to draw when you do the scene, the requisite scene of the christening. I didn't want to do the band and the ladies and the guys and so I thought, what's going on underwater? So I decided to go down below. Now you would maybe hear the muffled sound of the orchestra playing or the band playing, and you might see some hints of red, white, and blue floating in the water or through the ripples and so on. But what I was intrigued by was the fact that this 1,000-foot-long object, with all its weight, has just been floated X number of feet off the wooden supports, and where it has been for 18 months, growing. And so I just did it a completely different way. You wouldn't know it was christening, but that's where it is in the sequence of images in the book. Gets to the end of the dry dock and out into the river, and everything's finished that has to be finished, from all the safety features and lifeboats, the engine room. All the machinery in the engine room is surrounded by asbestos because it's red hot. I was told by one of the engineers who was actually on the ship during some chunk of time during its voyages that they figured, in their spare time, these are engineers, they think numbers and so somebody's doing some calculations and so on and so forth. And he said, we figured out, okay, the pressure of the steam coming from the boilers into these turbines is X. What happens if one of them lets go? He said, we figured we had about 2 seconds before we were gone. That's how quickly the steam would infiltrate that space, cook everybody. So interesting. And yet they did it for, 15 years, 16 years, and for more years on other ships, earlier ships. But anyway, the pressure was higher here than pretty much anywhere else. Don't ask me what the pressure is, I don't remember now, but it's up there. Out for a test to see if this thing's doing what it's supposed to do and performing. This was my first attempt. I wanted to show the bridge with all the equipment on it, and then show the ship as the event is recorded, which is in really rough seas. And they had a tough time with this, getting it out there and so on. And they cut it short because there was a problem with one of the reduction gears. But you don't take the roof off the bridge if you're about to send your ship out into turbulent seas to test it. That didn't make any sense. So I gave up on that dramatic approach. Put it in what I hope are rough enough seas, but certainly not inviting seas. This is one of the smoke grenades or smoke things that actually indicates the end or the beginning of the run that's been set up, like 50-yard run, 50 mile or 50, something like that. Very long run to test it and gun it full speed and all that sort of stuff. But there's the equipment and what it connects to, and there's Gibbs up on the bridge. The launch itself from New York with the beginning of the first trip across the Atlantic, sailing along in 1957 to England, photograph taken actually in September of 1957. They got a distress call from a Coast Guard cutter that somebody on board was really ill and needed the attention of the ship. They needed the facilities of the United States, which has its own operating room. He had appendicitis, basically. They got him off, they treated him. He was on the ship when we were on it, but sailing the other way. He was being taken back home, feeling a lot better and having eaten like a king, probably, now that he was no longer on that little guy. But anyway, that's that little connection. And this is the piece that opens up. And take your time with that one. Southampton, the dock at Southampton, where the ship would depart from and arrive at. We are being brought, there's the train that you saw in Lancashire at the very beginning. We're on it, we're being brought into the dock now, into the dock building. And we will work our way towards the ship. And I wanted to create an image here that would, again, Gibbs standing in the shipyard in Philadelphia, Macaulay standing on the dock, seeing this huge thing for the first time. I have no idea what my actual impressions really were, so I did have to sort of wing it a little bit here. But train coming in on the left-hand side, way out of scale, but intentionally because it's foreshortened, you just don't know that. And so on. You know, I'm just trying different things. And, okay, there's the Macaulay family boarding the ship. Now, we have two photographs that record us on the ship. One is us getting on the ship, and the other is us having dinner at this special gala dinner they have. And so there we are, boarding the ship. The picture is taken, and this woman with this package wrapped in brown paper stands right in front of me. She doesn't know, but she does. And so because I've become reasonably proficient with Photoshop, I was able to get rid of her. So she's gone. Now it's just the family, as it should have been from the beginning. So I use this as a starting point for the drawing. This is an early sketch of the drawing. The final drawing is here. You can see she's at the back of the line. I didn't want to leave her out completely. She's still got this package. So, and the guy who's taking the photograph is here. Those are his feet, and the cameraman is standing behind him, and he's taking the tickets. Anyway, boarding the ship. I wanted to board the ship, but also begin to give you some idea of what the scale of the ship was like inside. This is an early sketch. The drawing I finally did was much cleaner and neater. There would have been more people running up and down the aisles probably at this point, but who knows. And our cabin, and my first view of our cabin with its porthole, look at that. Here's our cabin now, and there's our porthole. And this was the partition between our cabin and the next cabin. The partition sat right on that, like grooved. So, and then there would be a cabinet against it or a closet or something like that. So the cabinets and what would make up the thickness of the wall, but it was actually very, very narrow. And there is one of the pieces of aluminum. This is not part of the safety system. This is simply dividing the main areas of the deck into cabin chunks. On the ship, any opportunity for me to draw pulleys and ropes and pieces of machinery, you know I will go for. Meanwhile, this is really about my mother watching England get smaller. So after, fighting in the war and so on and so forth, she's now on this ship with her kids, heading for who knows what. Courageous decision. But also, I think both my parents were somewhat excited and intrigued by the idea. They didn't know, but that's the way they were. Let's try it. This is where I spent most of my time that wasn't in the movie theater, on the deck, looking at the bridge. I'm down here, this little guy. There I am, a little bit more attention. looking at the bridge. What am I sitting there for? I'm hoping that I look sad enough so that the guys on the bridge will look down at me and take pity on this poor kid who's sitting alone on the foredeck with nothing to do. Why don't we invite him up and let him play with the wheel? That's what I was thinking. That's what's going through my head. I'm thinking, because it worked once at a railway station in Wales, where they eventually invited me into the signal box, and I thought, well, how different can the crew of the United States be from those two guys in the signal box in North Wales? Apparently quite different. So there I am, and I never got invited up. But so a sketch of what I wanted. I just wanted this sense of, we've been in this big thing, and we're aware of bigness to some extent, and with the fold out, we really get a sense of the size of it. But in reality, we're not big at all. We're just a little tiny. And there's the west. There's the golden sun luring us across the Atlantic. And where's the Empire State Building, though? We should be able to see it by now. We should have been able to see it 1,000 miles ago. How to handle the 5-day crossing? I sort of created a calendar to start with the changing times, because the clock has to keep being adjusted. And then there are meals, of course. That was the one consistent thing every day that never changed, the timing and the seats in which we ate and the table at which we sat. The porthole, the changing sea, a little dramatic perhaps, but nevertheless. And finally, in the river where we begin to see what would have been New Jersey. Gala night, my mother, she's still seasick. That picture would not reflect it. Fortunately, this is not a full color photograph. So any greenish tint that might have been apparent, and that smile kind of, anyway. I decided not to make that drawing, which was my first intent, but actually to turn us around, to show the photographer and the backs of us, because I didn't just want to copy the photograph. That already exists. So I had more time to sort of show the room and so on and so forth. Okay, 4 o'clock in the morning, I'm up there waiting for the Empire State Building, go up on deck. The drawing that I finally did was this one, looking at New Jersey. The reason for this particular composition, the large capstan on the left and the boy on the right, is I want to mimic it in the next drawing, which is Gibbs on the left and his car on the right. So I flipped it. He's on the bank of the Brooklyn side of the river, near the site of the current Verrazano Narrows Bridge. He did it every time the ship came in. He was there at 5 in the morning, 6 in the morning, whatever it was. His driver would take him down there, and he welcomed his baby back home. And this really was his baby. This was the love of his life, this ship. But he also had this car. And I wanted the car to be really, it looks like it's going to eat him. I'm making him a little bigger now. But anyway, the finished drawing, after drawing it over and over and over again, this is the finished drawing. So there's his current means of transportation, not dissimilar in feel aesthetically from much of the interior of the United States. It wasn't luxurious, but it was really well done. And it was streamlined, because it might have to be filled with soldiers at some point. So that's that. We pull into the harbor up Hudson. I didn't use this drawing at all, but the important thing about this is the Empire State Building. This is that building that is so tall you hear about, hiding behind a gas tank of all things. But I never used it. This is the image I have in my head. This is the image we got when we approached the battery, and yeah, there it is. 3.5 miles away. So no wonder. But nobody told me about that, like depth and depth perception and what it could do to the apparent scale of something. I believed in illustrations. Part of, in a kind of ironic way, maybe it's what pushed me eventually into the world of illustration, because I knew, with a little care, I could manipulate small, innocent children and completely mislead them on actual facts. So, who doesn't want that opportunity? From a video, some stills from a video of the dock when the ship has arrived and the madness of the yellow cabs and all that sort of stuff. A couple of pictures to work with. Eventually sort of found a still image from the air of the dock and the front of it. I had to manipulate it. 57 Chevys waiting to pick us up. And the final drawing looks like this. We're under the West Side Highway. That's where the cars are sitting, waiting for the opportunity to sort of move forward, pick up their passengers in their 2 trunks, and head across the river or through the tunnel to New Jersey. I thought I need to explain that just to make a little more continuity all the way to New Jersey. One of my favorite drawings is this one with Manhattan and the river and New Jersey and the meadows. The drawing I finally made was this one. It was a little more straightforward and direct, but that's how close we were to Manhattan. And the ship, it's now 3 days later, the ship has completely restocked and new passengers, and it's heading back across the Atlantic to the UK. The last drawing I want to show you is this one. On the way to school, I crossed the railway tracks. I have always loved steam engines. Who could not love steam engines? And not just the smell. The smell of a steam engine is fantastic. But all engines have that sort of incredible scale and noise. They rumble and they shake you to your core. But on Monday nights was Boy Scout night, and I belonged to the Boy Scout troop fairly quickly. I joined that. And crossing at night, looking down the tracks that I've crossed twice a day going back and forth to school, I saw a light flash. And I stood there and I saw it flash again. And I didn't know what it was. I mean, I think, oh, there's a train coming. Get off the tracks. No, it's the top of the Empire State Building.
Oh.
And they're called the Freedom Lights, and they rotated. So every once in a while, of course, it lined up perfectly with 8 miles away, the railway tracks in Bloomfield, New Jersey. And I saw this light, and I thought, it's been there all along. So the building that I had really been angry at when we pulled in turned out to become an old friend and a kind of, something that we sort of felt was kind of looking out for us, or I felt that way anyway. Completely changed my attitude. You need a title page, and you need a title. I want to go from east to west, so I have to turn the countries upside down so that we can flow from left to right to mimic the east-west journey. And here I've written France and Spain and England and so on. But if I'm going to do that, I have to write France and Spain and England upside down to match the map. But that looks like a mistake. So I take my name and I turn it upside down to match that, so people know this is not just a screw-up of some sort. This is actually an intentional decision for some bizarre reason, which happens to be very simply moving from left to right and encouraging that process. Another title, short story long. Crossing on Time pops up at some point, but then we went on to other titles. I just couldn't make up my mind. The most obvious one. And finally, the piece of art for it looks like this, and the title gets dropped in and so on. But there we are. This is my friend. Thank you.